if you can't actually just buy something at the point when you are minded to buy that, then you've lost. It doesn't matter how familiar someone is with your brand. So actual physical availability is the most crucial thing in the world. And that's why the kind of multi-brand retailers exist.
Hey, retail fans, welcome back to Retail Oriented. I am your host, Mike Fowler. I am the Vice President of Retail Sales here at the Sales Factory. And today I am really excited because we have got a very special guest. Mr. John Lyons from Loughton, England is here. He has had a storied career and helped some really beloved brands kind of grow their footprint, both in retail and grow the footprint of their brand. So we are super excited to have him. John, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mike. Delighted to be here.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your background. Can you kind of fill us in on how did we get to today and walk us through a little bit of your background and tell the folks at home who we're talking to?
Yeah. So I'll cut out the early part, other than to say I started life as an architect. But I found my way into marketing through digital to start with. So back in the early days of digital, kind of mid to late 90s, I founded a pretty successful digital agency. And we worked with some great brands there, did a lot of stuff in entertainment, did a lot of stuff with promotional marketing. And about 10 years in, we agreed an acquisition with a US partner that we'd been working with for some time, and launched the first global office of the US agency, Brand Movers, over here in London, focusing on the Europe market. So come the late noughties, I was kind of MD Europe at Brand Movers. Spent a good 10 years there, specializing in promotional marketing. So it was digital promotions globally. Obviously, my role was to grow the Europe business, but also support the US office, and also support the growing of other offices elsewhere, including India. So it was a fascinating time because we got to see lots of different brands, lots of different marketplaces, and lots of really interesting and kind of fascinating differences in the retail landscape and the brand landscape in those places. So yeah, I stayed doing that for 10 years, and then I kind of figured, it was more or less 20 years in the same kind of structure. It was time to jump at it and go alone. So I did a bit of consultancy, working primarily with kind of agencies, actually, on their kind of marketing, brand and business plans, before rocking up at a fantastic promotional agency over here in the UK, MDL, who I'd got to meet to discuss some consultancy work. And the CEO just wouldn't let me go. So he designed a role for me, which was wonderful, and opened me up to even more brands, kind of globally and Europe-based. And so kind of through much of that, what I was doing was coming up with the kind of the concepts and the mechanics for how brands could activate, whether or not in retail or online, but ultimately how brands can connect with their consumers in a meaningful and profitable way. And I stayed there for a couple of years, loved it there. And as you know, Mike, I kind of, my eyes sparkled. I saw a role at the Lego Group. We were just briefly chatting before coming on to the recording. You and your son love playing with Lego. Me and my son love playing with Lego. Loved it as a brand as a kid, and actually worked them at a previous agency, and went in-house at Lego for a period working on the loyalty program. So did that for a little while, and it was kind of interesting because a lot of my US promotional experience came into play. But ultimately, kind of, again, it didn't quite work out for me. So really sort of, I guess now kind of doing a little bit of freelance work, again, kind of working with brands, working with agencies to kind of set them straight. So it's a 20 plus year marketing career. And I've kind of gone from entrepreneur to kind of marketing specialist to marketing generalist, but always had a fascination with to me where everything plays out. The real arena of brand and marketing is the retail, is store footprint. So yeah, great to talk to you about that today.
Yeah, well, that's exciting for us because we love retail, and we love kind of how those decisions are made in the brick and mortar stores. We love how decisions are made online. We love understanding how different types of consumers are interacting with brands. So that's what we like to talk about quite a bit. And so you've got such an interesting background with a lot of different brands, a lot of different types of consumers, a lot of different decisions in different retailers. So I'm just going to kind of start really big picture and describe for us a little bit, what is it that you love and that you're drawn to specifically at retail? What is fascinating about how those decisions are made to you?
So really, retail is where brands come to life, and it's where consumers pick their brands, and it's where we actually see how people genuinely deal with brands and products. Quite often we get, as marketers, particularly brand side marketers, we get caught up in our love for the brand and our obsession with the brand. And all it takes is a few seconds in the aisles of a retailer to see just how little attention consumers generally kind of pay to stuff that we give blood, sweat, and tears over. But that I actually see as the key role to marketing and brand. It's we need to think really, really hard to make sure that the consumer doesn't have to think hard when they pick up our product from the shelf, and you can really see that in play. And I'll be honest, I'm a bit of a retail nerd, so slight differences between the US and the UK. So what we have here is a small number of very large grocers, kind of much like Kroger, I guess, in the US. But they, at their larger end, they tend to move into a fuller suite of things, kind of knocking on the door maybe of the Walmarts and Targets of the world. But there's nothing I like more than walking around a supermarket or a huge store and just looking down the aisles, just looking what's on the shelves and looking how people behave. And so, this morning, I went out to buy 2 things from my local supermarket. I came back with about 6, but it's not until you see a product on shelf with 100 other products all offering exactly the same outcome, in effect, that you start to realize the value of brand and the value of promotions and actually how you can win and lose in the retail space. And my last trip to the US, kind of visiting family down in Atlanta, Georgia, I drove them absolutely crazy because I kept disappearing in stores. Once we went to a Kroger just to pick up some stuff for dinner. They couldn't find me for an hour and a half because it was all new to me as well. And so, I'm walking down an aisle that's packed so many biscuit brands. Now, we don't have what you guys call biscuits here in the UK. We use the term biscuits to describe what you would call cookies. So the whole concept of biscuits is fascinating to me, and to see just the sheer range there, and you kind of see the differences in locations and types of store in terms of what people are buying. This, of course, the particularly the bigger retailers, they know what their audience needs. They've got the data. They're stacking up on stuff that they know will come off the shelf. So it's a real insight into kind of how people live their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And so you're hitting on some things that are really close to home for me and for our company. Store walks, that's not different internationally. We love to be in the store and understand, what are people picking up? How are they interacting with products and brands at the store level? Because you can learn so much about how people are making decisions by just going to walk a store, right? So we love to do that also, and it's so insightful. You kind of talked about just being passionate about retail and retailers. Talk a little bit about what retailers are expecting of brands in terms of promotional efforts and how to grow businesses together, from the big retailers, you mentioned Walmart and Target, all the way down to kind of smaller retailers and even direct to consumer type of efforts for brands. Can you talk through what are some of the differences and kind of what's expected?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, it's as you describe, it's a kind of multi-layered and quite complicated arena. The reality is that volume volume power. So if you are a small brand going to a large retailer, you're going to have to work particularly hard to get any chance of getting on shelf. And quite often that's where promotions will come into play. So in many cases, running sales promotions in with retail partners is kind of, I guess you could consider it almost a tax to being on shelf. And it differs depending on the size of your brand, because obviously, as you can imagine, being the Lego Group, for example, there's much more leverage because, hey, people are buying this already. But likewise, also, if you're Target, everyone's coming here already. And interestingly, one of the last things I worked on at the Lego Group was I worked in the loyalty program, which at the point that I joined was only connected to owned retail store. So Lego brand retail stores and Lego.com. We launched an integration with Target whilst I was there because we saw that for the program, there was an opportunity to grow because lots of people are buying their Lego sets from Target who aren't even aware of the program. And from Target's point of view, getting the support of Lego and being the first people on board with the program was a big hit. So actually those two kind of huge players in the game, it came together really quickly and really nicely. It can be a lot more difficult if you're a new product coming to market to find space on shelf. Because I mean, as well as kind of having the established brands on there, the established brands have also got the money to spend on the campaigns, promotional campaigns. They can afford to discount, particularly if they've got a kind of a kind of house of brands. They can to kind of discount on some of the brands. But also kind of there's the leverage of pulling out, and we have seen that over the years as well. So to be a new brand trying to get on shelf, you really have to go a lot further. You have to offer a lot more, and that can be really difficult because ultimately what the retailers want is to get people in store buying things and buying more things. And one of the easiest mechanics for them is discounting, whether or not that's kind of two for the price of one or just kind of 25% off. And that's great for the retailer, but it's not so great for the brand. So, brands trying to find the balance between being seen as a price player as opposed to building brand equity, it's a difficult playoff, and it's not always easy to get right. And I think kind of, obviously, if you're going to the bigger retailers, you've got volume, you've got spread. If you're going to the smaller retailers, you're having to spend more time negotiating each of those. So it's a real stretch on the resources, although you might actually get a more mutually beneficial partnership going with retailers. And quite often it's a good way to test bed what you're doing out there. So, I know kind of, again, the marketplace is quite different in the US to the UK, but working with specialist retailers rather than the big box retailers is going to be an easier way to get on shelf, to prove intent from consumers that you can then use further down the line to take to the big box. D2C is much more easy because you're ultimately managing the store yourself. So and that we had that with the Lego loyalty program where it operated within our owned channels, so we could make choices there. We're instantly seeing the feedback, the response. We can tweak and turn things on and off. But obviously with D2C, you've got to build your own audience from nothing. So there's all these differences to find in terms of, ultimately what everybody wants is to have as many people as possible that are going to be in market for a product, being able to buy that product, to have the physical availability. But in order to get there, you've got to play the game a little bit, and that's where promotions quite often come in.
Do you find it's helpful for brands to partner with third parties, with agencies, with groups that are kind of have expertise in different retailers to kind of help them navigate those channels from time to time? Because one of the things that I'm kind of, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, but one of the things that I'm understanding is there's a lot of different size brands. There's a lot of different size retailers. There's e-commerce and direct to consumer. There's a lot of different ways that you can get your product out in the market, and finding the right fit, no matter your size of brand or your size of retailer, it's possible, but sometimes you need a little help kind of navigating that. Do you see that, or have you seen that often in your career?
Yeah. I mean, certainly in terms of the execution, absolutely. So, quite often, if you've got a good marketing team and you've got a good kind of brand manager at the kind of product level or the brand level, and looking at what the opportunities are and establishing where there's more likely to be bang for the buck is something that quite often can be done in-house. But then how to deliver that in a way that offers value to the brand without devaluing the product and offers value to the retailer, quite often it comes into play that you'll be working for a specialist agency. And for probably about 12 years or so across two different agencies, I was very much in that world of okay, you've got a brand, you're going to be doing something here. What can we do that is going to attract the consumer? And what are we going to do that's going to add benefit to the brand and also to the retailer? And again, one of the things that I've always kind of tried to push towards, and you can't always do this, and sometimes you have to just bite the bullet and go with discounting, because that's the only way to get on shelf. And if you're not on shelf, you're not visible. Well, you're not visible or available, really. But if you can come up with a promotional mechanic that doesn't devalue the product or doesn't set a price point in the mind of the consumer that you then want to move up from, then you've got a much better chance of being able to retain that brand and retain that value. So a lot of my time in promotions was around prize promotions. So looking at the kind of prizes that will appeal to the segments that we're targeting, that will play to the particular retailers, and also what kind of add-ons might be in there. Because if we are, for some reason, doing a discount, how can we tie that in with a mechanic where, let's say, we can build an email database, or we can create a bit more of a buzz socially, word of mouth. So it's always about trying to work out where we can find the value, because otherwise, I mean, the easiest thing for retailers is give us some money off, we'll put it on shelf, we'll trial it, we'll see how it goes. I think one of the other interesting things, which we've seen a lot more of lately, is it's not just a battle now with the established brands or established products, should we say, but a lot of the smart brands out there are doing extended lines and new product development. So, and you see a lot of this in the drink category where, Bailey's is a great example. Bailey's Irish Cream has been around forever. It's a fabulous Christmas drink. But now they're having different seasonal variations, and they've got vegan versions. And suddenly what used to be one product taking up maybe 3 spaces on shelf is now 6 products taking up 12 spaces on shelf, which leaves a lot less space for the little guy. So trying to get into those spaces and prove that there's value in you staying in there is probably more difficult than it's been for a long time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. A lot of those decisions, when we're experiencing brands that are having line extensions and they're getting into new categories, when it's done well, they always start with the consumer, right? So they're understanding a need that's out there that they could potentially fulfill that aligns with who their brand is at the core, right? And so that's usually when we're seeing it done well, it's a natural extension of what they do, right? So that.
Absolutely.
I think that's really interesting. One of the things that you talked about was kind of this mutually beneficial relationship between brands and retailers. And I know you've talked a lot about kind of the concept of loyalty and brand loyalty programs. How do brands approach that? Because, a lot of times our clients and the people that are listening to Retail Oriented, their brands, their manufacturers, they're trying to approach this and figure out that mutually beneficial relationship with whomever their retailer is. How do they approach the loyalty conundrum, so to speak, whether it's brand loyalty or loyalty programs? Where do they start?
So I think, in all honesty, when it comes to loyalty, I think we need to start with trying to work out what it is we want to achieve before considering whether or not loyalty is the answer. Obviously, I have worked in loyalty. I've worked in loyalty agency side and client side, and I've seen a lot of success come from it. And I know there are a lot of people that will kind of say, "Oh, there's no such thing as brand loyalty." It's not the case. There is such a thing as brand loyalty, and actually, quite often I find people quoting Aaron Bass Institute and How Brands Grow, saying, "Oh, that shows that there's no loyalty." No, I'm sorry, you just haven't read the book properly. It says that there's loyalty, and that loyalty brand loyalty is the double jeopardy law applies equally to brand loyalty as it does anything else. The bigger brands will have more loyalty. That's just a fact of life. I think when it comes to how brands deal with it and how brands and retailers deal with it, the question for me is, what are we trying to achieve? And I think you need to step back sometimes and be really honest about what your product does and how people are using it. Because I'll say, from as someone who worked on the Legos loyalty program, Lego is a brand that is genuinely loved. Most are not. Most are kind of preferred rather than loved, but Lego is genuinely loved. But even then, everyone at Lego and everyone in the program knows that people aren't exclusively buying Lego. Whatever category you consider Lego as, whether or not it's a collectible or a toy, and actually it's kind of both, and that's part of its power. But even the most dedicated Lego fans will still buy from rivals. So yeah, the idea of kind of unadulterated loyalty really doesn't exist. But is it a case that we want people to just buy more of our stuff, in which case it becomes very transactional? Or is there something else that we want to get out of the consumer brand relationship? I use the word relationship very loosely, because none of this is comparable to human relationships. So loyalty with a brand is not the same as loyalty with a life partner, and relationship with brand is not the same as a relationship with a friend. It's just the terminology we use. But having things like people signing up to an email or following on a social channel or coming to events, there's all these other benefits and bonuses to having more than just someone picking up your product and walking away with it. And one of the kind of early programs I worked on, which was in the US and proved really successful for a period, we worked on Nerf perks at a previous agency for Hasbro. And as a manufacturer, they sold exclusively third-party through retailers. They had really no understanding of their consumer base. Because of that, there was no first-party data. And what the loyalty program allowed them to do was to build that picture and get a much better understanding and actually challenge some of the assumptions that they'd made. So, everyone went into it thinking 13-year-old kids and frat boys. And some of the heavier buyers were professionals, like middle-aged professionals. And it really opened up a different perspective. And the Lego Group also are brilliant at using that data to see what it is people are buying into, what passion points they're buying into, who they're buying for, where they're buying. So all of this kind of stuff gives you a fuller picture, which I wouldn't say is invaluable, but it has a value that might make it worth the fact that you're spending money to run a program. And maybe the program is or isn't profitable. Not all are, some are, the best ones are. But there needs to be a balance between it, because ultimately it is a trade-off. But yeah, I think kind of, as I say, I don't think all categories and I don't think all brands are equal. So for example, I saw the Lego Vincent van Gogh Starry Night set and I wanted it. Yeah, it wasn't a case of I want a toy or I want the collectible, I want that thing. And Lego is the brand that makes that kind of thing, which is very different from I'm thirsty, I want something to drink. So I would consider myself pretty loyal to Diet Coke. I've always preferred the taste of Diet Coke to full fat Coke. I've always preferred that to Pepsi. I'm a diabetic. Seeing the silver can with the red ribbon, I know that I can safely drink that. But if I'm thirsty and they don't have it, I'll buy a Diet Pepsi, or I'll buy a water, or I'm British, I might buy a tea. So there's all sorts of alternatives. Nobody's going to die because they can't find their preferred brand. So I think kind of being realistic about where we are between a preference and a passion is quite important. So I think brands need to be very realistic about that. But how you'd work with the retailer is also crucial, because quite often it's the physical availability through the retailer that is the jump off point for the consumer. So if you're able to kind of partner with a retailer that's got a strong loyalty program, or you do a crossover, which actually is what we did with Nerf Perks with Target, several years ago, and Amazon and various others. But we started with Target um, because they saw the opportunity to kind of benefit from what the program was generating and add to it, and the program saw the benefit of feeding into what Target were doing and add to it. So you can get a kind of very mutual beneficial thing there.
So that's really interesting when we're talking about kind of loyalty and how that relationship works with a retailer and the ability to use the understanding of a consumer, the understanding of how a brand um, is represented to that consumer and what that brand means to the consumer. You mentioned, is it a passion or is it a preference? I think that's very perfectly put, right? Because we can make decisions based on a number of different factors, and how I react with a shoe brand may be laissez-faire. I may not really care about shoes, but how I react with a bicycle brand or something that's really important to me is very different, right? So understanding who you are to the consumer is so important, and how that impacts the retailer, and how that relationship with the retailer and the brand and the consumer, kind of that triangulated relationship works well together, is how we can grow together, right? So I want to talk a little bit about, growing businesses specifically as a brand, and how that partnership with a retailer is so important in that growth, right? So the idea of using your marketing to kind of stand out in a retailer. You mentioned some specific partnerships with Lego and Target. Things like that are really interesting to me, in that they've been very thoughtful about, okay, what are some different things that we can do to provide a usable and interesting thing for a consumer that's going to increase everybody's preference and grow their brands together. So can you talk about that mutual growth and how important that is, and how marketing plays a role in that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, at its most base level, and of course you know this, but I'll start from here. At its most base level, products need retailers to find consumers, and retailers need products to have something to supply to consumers. So we start off with a kind of mutual need. It becomes imbalanced by success quite often. So we know. I mean, certainly over here in the UK, there's been an ongoing issue for a number of years now with we're a small nation. We're basically the size of a state, right? So we don't really have the kind of regional retailers that they have in the US. And I've done some work in the past with Southeastern grocers, so I'm quite familiar with some of the setup. We have a handful of nationwide powerhouse supermarkets, basically grocers extended out. And if the biggest, or a couple of the biggest, decide that they want to pay under cost value for milk, then suddenly farmers are in a position where they have to decide what they're going to do about that. And we have had a period where the government has had to subsidize milk because the supermarkets weren't willing to pay the actual cost of milk, which is crazy. So, it can go too far one way, and it can go too far the other way. I mean, sometimes brands will try to have an unrealistic view of their aspirational value, and not like the way that they're being sold by the retailer. But the retailer knows the people that are buying, and that's really crucial. So even if you're a very well-educated, really smart, well-trained brand marketer, don't forget that the retailers, whilst they've got their own agenda, they understand what makes consumers take stuff off the shelf, because that's how they choose to stack their shelves. So I think it's really important, therefore, to kind of understand what is the dynamic. And the dynamic is usually that the retailer wants to find new ways to beat their competition. And that traditionally will be about exclusive products, or it will be about promotions or price cuts. And the retailer wants to get pushed forward. So what it normally comes down to is, there will be your kind of promotional windows, 52p, and coming up with what you're going to do in each of those, and making sure that it works for both sides. Quite often, unless if you're a super powerful brand, you're kind of at the whim of the retailer. So again, as I mentioned before, kind of looking out for what additional value you can get from things as a brand, because ultimately you're kind of paying for this to happen in order to earn your space on shelf, in order to earn the extra kind of shopper marketing, your barkers and your wobblers and all these kind of things that are going to make you stand out on shelf. So making sure that you make the most of that opportunity, but always having in back of the mind what the consumer, what the retailer wants for it. So one example, you might be able to see my whiskey back there. We did a campaign for a whiskey brand called Famous Grouse. They're owned by the Edgerton Group here. And they were wanted to do a program. And again, it was about retaining shelf space. At a key point, they had a sporting sponsorship. So their kind of window was fairly closed. And what the retailer wanted was footfall. And what the brand wanted was purchase. So we looked into whether or not we could actually tie in actual purchase, but the technology wasn't there for it. So what we actually came up with in the end, and this was the agency I was at, was, okay, well, let's have a really visible, really visual kind of shopper installation with a QR code. And it's basically scan for a chance to win. And because it was basically a big set piece, we knew that people could take a picture of the QR and pass to friends, but yeah, it was the closest we could get to making sure that people were in store. And again, whilst we couldn't drive people to actively purchase or prove that they purchased, we knew that they would have been standing in front of or landed on a branded destination. So it ticked lots of boxes along the way to the ultimate journey. And it was very successful. It was tied into an ECRM system, so we were able to kind of get lots and lots of entries. We were able to look at where they were. We had a winner a day for a couple of weeks, I think it was, and there was a great spread around the country. And so both the retailer and the brand were super happy about it. And it was just kind of thinking about, right, okay, well, these are our limitations. And sometimes as a creative, as an agency, the limitations are brilliant because they force you to be much clearer about what you can do and how to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting talking about kind of limitations, because I just wrote down authenticity on my notes here because I want to talk to you a little bit about that. You mentioned some of the massive brands have the ability to kind of dictate the way and the terms that they want to go to market, right, with retailers. But often it's got to be a partnership, right? And so how do you see, and do you see it often where brands are very authentic and transparent with their retail partners and saying, hey, these are the things that we can do well, these are the things that we can't do well, and do you see that as a strategy for kind of long-term success and partnership together? And have you seen that play out well, or have you seen that blow up in people's faces ever?
I mean, where I've seen that work really well is with smaller and niche retailers. So, you know, kind of if it's a health brand, you're working with a health store, a health food store. So over here we have Holland & Barrett. You're going to get more support, and it's going to be a more authentic partnership through that than it will be going to a big box retailer, unless you're a big box brand. So I think it really is about kind of it's about the balance of power. It really is so much about the balance and power, and also the kind of the ethos of the brand. So, you know, if you're looking at well, let's take a couple of examples. You know, kind of the support and the kind of support that someone like Liquid Death might be able to get compared to Desana. You know, it's a completely different playing field. One, you've got the slightly discredited product from the major player, and the other one, you've just got this thing that seems to come out of nowhere, and everyone gets in on the call. So, and again, you know, retailers know that this is going to appeal to people. This is going to appeal to some people. Are they our people? Yes, they are. We want to be part of this. How can we help you make the best thing it can be? And you know, if you're super huge, maybe you get that. Maybe you're spending so much with a retailer and you're putting so much on shelf that they're going to do anything for you anyway. But normally it's about working with the smaller retailers because they'll understand where you come from, particularly if it's a kind of niche. As I say, they'll understand what your your intentions are. They'll understand kind of what your ethos is, and it is far more authentic because it's not only looking at the spreadsheets.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which are super important. Let's not put down spreadsheets.
Yeah, we can't knock the spreadsheets. There's a lot of interesting decisions that could be made in a spreadsheet, right? John, thank you so much for joining us. I do have a couple. I'm going to go through some rapid fire questions with you, kind of like fire off a question, first thing that comes to your mind. And you actually gave me a great segue with Liquid Death, because the first question is, and you can't use Liquid Death because you've already used it, but are there any brands recently that have just kind of shocked you with their growth and how rapid and robust their growth has been? You mentioned a really good one, so I'm going to take that one off the table.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple that I can think of over here. And I know they're not just over here. Whether or not they're in the US, I don't know. I mean, one of the most astonishing growths I've seen is, again, I'm going back to my stereotypical being a Brit, Yorkshire tea. So Yorkshire tea, it was nowhere. It was a nowhere brand. We had two major players in the black tea category in the UK, and they'd been there for decades and decades. And within a fairly short period of time, Yorkshire tea has managed to take over and go to number one in that category, by being smart, by being authentic, by being funny, and also taking opportunity of just the laziness of the category leaders. So yeah, for me, that is one of the most astonishing growths I've ever seen. Something else that I've really found interesting lately, and I don't know, maybe you could tell me, I don't know if it's in the US yet. It's a Dutch brand, but it's a chocolate brand called Tony's Chocolonely. And they're very much purpose driven. In fact, they started out as a campaign rather than a brand. And so their whole thing was that they want to cut bad practice in the chocolate trade, slavery, child labor, and they just happen to have developed a really, really, really good product, which is super expensive. So when I first saw it over here, it was you only saw it in 2 or 3 of the real luxury retailers, the real high-end retailers, but it's such good stuff. It's now everywhere, and that the message is getting across that they're able to kind of nudge, not bully, but kind of show and tell and prove that it can be done to the bigger boys as well. So again, they for me have been a really fascinating watch.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned 2 kind of concepts there, actually a lot of concepts, but 2 that stood out to me is, one is research and development coming out with an outstanding product that just kind of brings you to the forefront. The other being smart and creative and kind of attacking some apathy in bigger players in the market. And there's usually opportunity sometimes in those categories. So that's really, really interesting stuff. Okay, next question. When you feel kind of stuck with a business problem or something that you're just kind of mired down or in a rut, what's your process for kind of getting the ideas flowing and getting out of a thought process rut?
I think you're going to like where I'm going with this, and it almost sounds like I'm making it up, but this is genuinely what I do. I'll go to a store. I'll go to a store and I'll look at things and I'll look at people. And it's one of the things that I really enjoyed about kind of being at the Lego Group, because the people who work in the stores are so wonderful. I mean, the store associates are just impeccable, but also the people that are going to the stores know that it's more than just a retail. Yeah, it's very on brand, as you can imagine. So I'd quite often just go down there and walk around and look about, and people would just chat. And I live in London, as you said. In London, people aren't allowed to speak to strangers. It just doesn't happen. You get given very strange looks. So if we're on our underground on the tube, everyone's looking away from each other. It's a real standoffish kind of city, but not in Lego stores. So every time I struggled with something there, I'd just go down to a store and I'd watch and I'd listen and I'd end up chatting with people, and you just see more of what's actually going on, because ultimately, however clever we want to be, our job as a marketer is to make sure that that person in the store likes, or that person in the store knows what is in the store for them. And that's all our job is, to kind of, and people talk about persuasion and all sorts of other things. And, I won't get into the semantics of it, but ultimately they need to know that something exists and they need to know they can get it. And so kind of, looking at the different messaging and stuff like that, that always switches me back.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great stuff. I think, the two things that I always go to, and nobody asked me to share, but I'm going to anyways, were exactly what you said, being in the store, understanding kind of a consumer's journey to making a decision, and seeing, you get so many ideas and so much inspiration from seeing how people interact. And then the other side of that, which I think is also really interesting, is walking manufacturing facilities and understanding from a manufacturer, what is it that you do well? What's at the core of who you are? Do you test better than everybody else? What sets you apart? And then helping to connect those two worlds, right? And make a purpose for a consumer. I think kind of getting out from behind the desk is so valuable. It's really good word for our listeners. I switched the last question here and we've talked a little bit about kind of marketing strategies in the UK versus the US, but I want to ask you, if you had one thing to kind of share with brands out there, with manufacturers and with brands out there, what would you want brands to know? If you could say one thing, like, what would you want brands to know?
Ultimately, the most important thing in growing business is to be available. And Byron Sharp has talked about mental availability and physical availability, and kind of mental availability is being aware of something, right? But if you can't actually just buy something at the point when you are minded to buy that, then you've lost. It doesn't matter how familiar someone is with your brand. So actual physical availability is the most crucial thing in the world, and that's why the kind of multi-brand retailers exist. Because if I want a drink, I could wander around hoping that I might find a store that Coca-Cola own, or I can go into the local supermarket or whatever and choose from a range of them. So understanding that what the retailers provide is the most important thing for any brand to grow. And even with D2C brands, I mean, we've seen a shift in D2C brands, firstly going from purely digital offerings to many of them are now advertising on TV, out of home, etc. But also a lot of them are now moving into availability through high street retailers and department stores and stuff. So it's possible to run at different speeds. You can start up as a D2C and focus very much on the low hanging fruit. But if you're going to grow from that, you need to be where consumers have the need for your product, whatever that is. And again, kind of, I'm going to sound like a real Ehrenberg Bass nerd now, but there's been a lot of talk about category entry points, which isn't what is the category and do they know your brand? It's what is the need that takes me into a category. So if it's Diet Coke, well, it's because I want a drink. I'm either thirsty or I'm hot, or I just want to relax. Those are maybe different reasons. I'm never going to think I would like some fizzy brown water. It worked that way. So the more places you're available where people might want to do things. And again, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper have done brilliantly with this in terms of the deals that they've done with quick service restaurants, with retailers large and small. You can get these things everywhere because anywhere you are, you're going to get thirsty. So I think it's understanding that it's part of the chain of getting to the consumer, and what you need to focus on is, once the consumer is there, how do you give yourself a better chance of being the choice from all of the other competitors that will be there, and they will be there.
Yeah. Availability when the decision is being made. It's so crucial to success, right? And so I love that. John, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being on the podcast. Any things that you want to plug or places people can find you that you want to shout out?
So probably the best place to find me will be on Twitter at the moment, whilst it's still there. So I'm Johnny Ego at Twitter, and my I'm a hat. I am a hat on Twitter. So Johnny Ego on Twitter is the best place to find me, or John Lyons on LinkedIn, which I think we got a better chance of knowing is going to be there soon.
Well, John, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you coming on the show.
No, it's been great. It's been great. You too.
Okey-doke.
Take care.
See ya. So there you have it. It was really interesting talking with John today. We learned a lot. I hope you guys learned a lot as well. If there's anything else that you want to hear from us, other guests that you want to have on Retail Oriented, or the specific topics that you want to hear about, let us know in the comment section. Go to our website and fill out one of those little forms, salesfactory.com. Send that our way. You can email me directly at mike.fowler@salesfactory.com. Let us know what you want to hear. We love talking with John. Really enjoyed that conversation. We hope you did too. And if you did, please hit the like button, the little thumbs up, maybe even subscribe, share it with some friends, and make sure that you hit the little bell icon so that every time an episode of Retail Oriented comes out, you make sure you get that first and are notified when it comes out. Again, we really appreciate you guys joining us today. And I'm Mike Fowler. Remember, when you're thinking about retail, it's all about selling in and selling through.